At the end of the 19th century, the United States was experiencing something that had no precedent in its own history, nor in that of almost anywhere else. An explosion of wealth so fast, so concentrated, and so brutal that even those who were generating it hardly knew how to handle it. Railroads that crossed continents, steel mills that produced more metal than entire countries, banks, trusts, monopolies that turned men with unknown surnames into multimillionaires in a single generation. It was a young country, powerful, unstoppable, but with a problem that could not be easily bought. It had no past. There were no castles inherited over centuries. There were no ancient noble titles. There were no bloodlines that went back to crusades, empires, or kings. There was money, enormous amounts of money, but everything smelled new. On the other side of the Atlantic, Europe was living the opposite situation, a continent saturated with history, with palaces, titles, coats of arms, endless family trees, but with less and less real liquidity to sustain all of that. The old European aristocracies continued living, surrounded by symbols of power, but economic power was slipping through their fingers. Maintaining castles, armies of servants, lands, ceremonies, and lifestyles designed for another era was becoming more and more difficult. And so a perfect historical paradox began to form. Europe had prestige, but it lacked money. America had money, but it lacked prestige. While Europe was losing relative economic weight, the United States was producing millionaires faster than it knew what to do with them. Families that, in a single generation, went from nothing to fortunes impossible to imagine. And then the question arose that would silently change the social history of both continents. What happens when the newest money in the world meets the oldest prestige? The answer was not a war. It was not a military conquest. It was something much more subtle and more human. American money began to cross the Atlantic, at first timidly. Trips, long stays in Europe, seasons in Paris, London, Rome. American millionaires wanted to learn how to behave like elites. They wanted culture, refinement, acceptance. But soon the phenomenon went further. Americans buying castles. Not as museums, not as tourist investments, as private residences, as symbols. French chateaux, Italian palazzi, English country houses, buildings that had belonged to noble families for generations, now sold to pay debts, taxes, or simply to survive. And even more striking, American women buying titles through marriage, because the exchange became clear to both sides. For many European aristocratic houses, marrying a son or a daughter to an American heiress was no longer a humiliation. It was a survival strategy. For American families, that marriage was an instant gateway into a world that money alone could not open. Money was beginning to buy history, and history was beginning to rent itself out so as not to disappear. But this phenomenon was not a simple fairy tale of rich men and princesses. Behind the glamour, there were very concrete forces pushing in opposite directions. On one side, the American hunger for legitimacy. The deep desire to prove that this wealth was not vulgar, not accidental, not just the product of smoking factories and exploited workers. A European title, an ancient surname, a castle with a coat of arms. All of that worked as a kind of certificate of cultural nobility. On the other side, European aristocratic decadence. Proud families, often ruined, trapped between the duty to keep up appearances and economic reality. For them, accepting American money meant saving properties, paying debts, keeping the family name alive, even at a huge emotional price. In the middle, the brutal culture clashes. American women raised in modern mansions with relative freedom, with a practical sense of life, landing in cold castles full of unwritten rules, invisible hierarchies, and suffocating expectations. Europeans educated to believe that lineage is everything, facing women who brought more money than they had ever seen, but who were not always willing to disappear behind their husband's title. And underneath it all, the personal tragedies. Loveless marriages, family pressure, loneliness in immense palaces. Entire lives sacrificed to maintain a balance between money and prestige. This is where our recurring figure comes in, the first human anchor of this story, an American heiress, immensely rich, educated to be a symbol, and at the same time deeply trapped. We are talking about Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo is not an isolated case, but she is one of the clearest, best documented, and most symbolic of this whole phenomenon. She will appear several times throughout this documentary because her life sums up, almost perfectly, what happens when money crosses the ocean and encounters a Europe that can no longer live on its past alone. She represents an entire generation of American women turned into human bridges between two worlds that needed each other, but did not understand each other. Because this exchange was not only economic, it was cultural, it was psychological, and in many cases it was devastating. Before we continue with castles sold, titles bought, and impossible marriages, we need to step back for a moment. We need to cross the ocean in the opposite direction. Because to understand why Europe was literally for sale, first we have to understand what was happening on the other side of the Atlantic, in that young, noisy, and obscenely rich country that was about to buy half of Europe's past without really knowing what to do with it. To understand why Europe was for sale, we first have to understand what was happening on the other side of the ocean. At the end of the 19th century, the United States was not just growing, it was accelerating. Railroads that crossed the continent like steel scars, oil wells that turned forgotten lands into instant fortunes, steel mills that produced more metal than entire empires, banks that moved capital on a scale that Europe was beginning to watch with a mix of admiration and fear. It was the age of industrial money, of modern, fast, aggressive capital. And with it, a new social class was born, the American millionaires. Their surnames today sound almost mythological to us: Vanderbilt, Astor, Gould, Rockefeller. But in their own time, those names did not evoke castles, crusades, or kings. They were new surnames. Names associated with businesses, not with bloodlines. There lay the central problem. These families had something that no European aristocracy had ever had in so little time: almost unlimited money. But they lacked something that, in the social imagination, was still crucial: history. There were no illustrious ancestors buried in cathedrals. There were no family trees stretching back to the 12th century. There were no titles passed down for generations. In theory, the United States had been born precisely to break with all of that. A republic without hereditary nobility. A country where anyone, at least in the founding myth, could rise to the top. But in practice, money does not take long to look for hierarchies. High society in late 19th century America is a fascinating paradox. Formally egalitarian, socially obsessed with status, mansions begin to rise like architectural monsters. Houses that are not designed to be comfortable, but to impress. Gigantic drawing rooms, theatrical staircases, dining rooms where hundreds of guests can fit. Balls become legendary. Excessive, almost grotesque events where each family tries to prove that it has more, spends more, is more refined than the last. They do not compete only with money, but with spectacle. But there is an insecurity running through that entire world. You can build the biggest mansion in New York. You can host the most expensive ball of the decade. You can fill your house with European art, bought with blank checks. And still, someone can look at you and think, yes, but who are you really? That symbolic void weighs especially heavily on certain figures, and few embody it as well as Alva Vanderbilt. Alva was not a passive heiress. She was ambitious, intelligent, obsessive, and she understood before anyone else something fundamental. In America, money by itself did not guarantee social legitimacy. Her obsession was not only to be rich, it was to be indisputable. She organized some of the most extravagant social events of her time. She had mansions built that looked like European palaces transplanted to New York. She took care of every detail: architecture, decoration, guest lists, rumors. But even that had a limit. Because deep down, all that effort was a performance. A stage set designed to convince a society that still looked toward Europe when it thought of true aristocracy. Here a key idea appears that defines this era. In Europe, the surname creates the palace. In America, the palace tries to create the surname. American mansions were too new, too perfect, too obviously designed for their purpose. They had no historical scars. They had not survived wars, revolutions, fires. They had no ghosts. And that mattered more than the millionaires wanted to admit. That is why many began to look outward. They traveled to Europe not only as tourists, but as aspirants. They bought European art to hang it in American houses. They hired architects trained in Paris or Rome. They imitated British and French social rituals. But imitating is not the same as belonging. And that is where marriage enters the scene as the most radical solution. Because if you cannot manufacture centuries of history, you can marry into them. For some American families, marrying a daughter to a European noble becomes the fastest way to close the symbolic gap. An apparently simple exchange. Europe offers titles, surnames, castles, prestige. America offers fresh, abundant saving money. But behind that exchange, there are deep tensions. American mothers like Alva see marriage as a social investment. They do not speak of love. They speak of position, of legacy, of the future. Daughters, in many cases, are raised to fulfill that goal without asking too many questions. They travel to Europe as guests and return as duchesses, countesses, or princesses. For American high society, that is a victory. The surname is no longer only industrial. Now it is aristocratic. But that victory carries a price that is rarely mentioned in the drawing rooms. Because those young American women do not only marry a man, they marry a system of rigid hierarchies, of suffocating expectations, of cold castles where money is welcome, but the person never quite is. Meanwhile, in Europe, the phenomenon is perceived with a mixture of relief and contempt. Relief, because American money saves properties that would otherwise be lost. Contempt, because accepting that money means admitting that the old world can no longer sustain itself on its own. Thus, an invisible bridge is gradually built between the two continents. A bridge made of checks, titles, marriage contracts, and awkward silences. America creates millionaires, but it needs Europe to turn them into something more than that. And Europe, which for centuries had lived off its history, begins to realize that history alone no longer pays the bills. And if America had money without history, Europe had history, but was beginning to run out of money. That imbalance is what explains everything that comes next. Forced marriages, personal tragedies, castles sold, titles rented. Because when money and history need each other, the result is rarely clean. While America was producing new fortunes at a speed never seen before, Europe was entering a much more uncomfortable phase, that of surviving its own past. For centuries, the European aristocracy had lived off the land. Agricultural rents, recycled feudal rights, local taxes, a slow, stable, deeply hierarchical system. But the world had changed. Industrialization shifted the center of economic power to cities, factories, banks. The countryside no longer produced enough. Rents fell, prices rose. And above all, modern states began to look upward. Progressive taxes arrived, detailed land registries, fiscal reforms that no longer respected ancient privileges. Suddenly, owning thousands of hectares did not mean being rich. It meant having thousands of hectares that had to be maintained, protected, administered, and paid for. And in the middle of all that, the castles, immense buildings, poorly insulated, horrendously expensive to heat. With leaking roofs, whole wings closed off, armies of servants essential just to keep the house from literally falling to pieces. The European aristocracy was then living a brutal contradiction. On the outside, glorious facades, coats of arms, ancestral portraits, drawing rooms that seemed frozen in time. On the inside, accounts in the red, hidden mortgages, loans between families, jewels pawned discreetly, paintings sold temporarily that never came back. Here our second recurring figure appears. He does not have a specific name because he represents many. An impoverished European aristocrat. A duke, a count, a minor prince. Educated from childhood to inherit a story, not a business. He learned classical languages, horsemanship, etiquette. But no one taught him to manage balance sheets, negotiate credit, or reinvent his assets. He lives in a castle too large for his reality. He walks through closed-off corridors to save on heating. He sleeps in a single wing while the rest of the house slowly darkens. He receives guests with dignity. He serves proper dinners even though each plate is carefully calculated. He speaks of the past with pride, but avoids speaking of the future. Because the future is an uncomfortable question. Selling land means breaking with generations. Selling the castle is almost a betrayal of the family name. Marrying beneath oneself is unthinkable. But not marrying well may mean total ruin. Here fits a phrase that is repeated, almost like a whisper, in many of these houses. They had centuries of history, but no money to heat the corridors. And even so, the pride persists. The European aristocracy does not see itself as a class in decline. It sees itself as a class temporarily misunderstood by a vulgar, accelerated world. Many believe that industrial money is temporary, that American fortunes are noisy, exaggerated, rootless, that sooner or later history will once again prevail. But while they wait for that imaginary return, the bills arrive on time. It is in this context that the gaze begins to cross the ocean, at first with distrust, then with pragmatism. Finally, with a mixture of resignation and calculation, the Americans do not have titles, but they have something Europe desperately needs: liquidity. And what Europe has and America wants is not only stone or land, it is inherited prestige. Thus, almost without anyone fully planning it, a strange market takes shape. A market that is not listed on stock exchanges and does not appear in financial newspapers. A market in which the following are exchanged: surnames, coats of arms, castles, marriages. A market where European pride is sold with white gloves, and American money comes in through the front door, pretending not to notice the cracks. When these two crises met, the American one of money without history, and the European one of history without money, something was born that would shape the fate of hundreds of lives. An unexpected market was born, the market of prestige, and in that market, the highest price was not always paid in dollars or pounds, but in private lives sacrificed to save public surnames. For a long time, the story of American heiresses in Europe was told like an elegant tale: extremely rich young women, romantic castles, charming princes in need of love and perhaps a bit of money. The reality was far less poetic. Noble titles were not bought officially. There was no catalog and no fixed price. But that does not mean there was no clear system, repeated and perfectly understood by everyone involved. The purchase of the title was indirect, wrapped in respectable, legal, and socially acceptable language. Its main mechanism had an ancient and very effective name: the strategic marriage. Everything began long before the couple met. In the United States, the great fortunes knew that money alone had a social ceiling. You could be invited into certain drawing rooms, but not all of them. You could have economic influence, but not that aura of legitimacy that Europe had cultivated for centuries. In Europe, many aristocratic houses knew exactly the opposite. Their surname opened every door, except that of the bank. So the exchange was organized with almost business-like precision. First, the contact. It was not made publicly. Intermediaries were used: diplomats, mutual friends, minor nobles experienced in both worlds, even lawyers specialized in international inheritances and marriages. Then came the evaluation. The European family investigated the American heiress, how much money she really had, what part was immediately available, what part would remain locked in trusts, whether the capital was stable or dependent on volatile businesses. The American family did the same: how old the title was, whether the castle was in good condition, whether the family was truly ruined or merely exaggerating, whether the future husband had hidden debts or character problems. Nothing was left to chance. One of the most important roles in this process was played by aristocratic mothers, women who had often lived their own marriage as a transaction and knew the rules of the game perfectly. They negotiated without romanticism. They knew how much their surname was worth. They knew how many more winters the castle could endure without renovations. They knew what part of the estate had to be saved for future generations. And they knew that if the heir married badly or did not marry, the house might disappear. On the American side, the mothers were no less aware. For them, marriage was a social investment. They did not speak of love. They spoke of position, of making sure the industrial surname mixed with an aristocratic one, of guaranteeing that their daughters were not just rich, but respectable in the eyes of the old world. Once the suitability was established, the heart of the deal arrived: the dowry. We are not talking about symbolic sums. We are talking about amounts capable of paying off debts accumulated over decades, restoring entire castles, maintaining an aristocratic lifestyle for generations, or, in some cases, saving a noble house from total bankruptcy. That money was rarely delivered without conditions. There were clauses, trusts, staggered payments. Sometimes it was established that the capital could only be used to maintain certain properties, or that it would pass to the children, guaranteeing the continuity of the lineage. In exchange, the European family offered something that could not be manufactured in America: a surname with centuries of history, a socially recognized title, a castle or palace that served as a physical stage for that legitimacy, and above all, the feeling of having entered a genealogy that preceded the money. Here it is worth dismantling another myth. It was not always the heiress who bought the title. In many cases, the title was rented for the long term. The surname survived. The castle was maintained. The European family continued to exist, but deeply transformed. And in the middle of all this was the least heard person in the entire operation: the bride. This is where we return to our recurring figure, this time not as a symbol, but as a real case: Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo was born into one of the richest families in the United States. Her life from childhood was carefully planned by her mother, Alva Vanderbilt. Strict education, clear expectations, an undeclared but ever-present goal to turn money into definitive social legitimacy. When Consuelo was presented in Europe, it was not as a tourist. It was as a candidate The man chosen for her was not poor, but his family had serious financial problems. The title was ancient, the palace impressive, the surname irreproachable. The deal was sealed between families long before she could truly give an opinion. The dowry was gigantic. The wedding, celebrated with all possible splendor. The press spoke of romance, of a transatlantic fairy tale. But what no one saw from the outside was the everyday reality. A young American woman, raised in a relatively modern environment, landing in a European house dominated by rigid rules, impossible expectations, and a hierarchy that placed her forever as a foreigner, no matter how much money she brought. The title protected her, and at the same time imprisoned her. This pattern was repeated dozens of times, not always with the same brutality, not always with the same level of unhappiness, but almost never as a simple story. Because buying a title did not mean buying belonging. It did not mean buying happiness. It meant buying a role in a play written centuries earlier. And many of the protagonists, especially the women, discovered too late that the true price of that deal was not in the checks, but in the life they would have to live afterward. Few stories explain this system better than that of a young American woman sent to Europe as part of a transaction. And it is there, in what happened after the wedding, that the fairy tale myth finally breaks. Imagine for a second that you are 19 years old, that the whole world looks at you as if it already knew what your destiny will be, and that your private life, your tastes, your fears, even your loves, is a minor detail compared to a much larger operation. In New York, at the end of the 19th century, that operation had a name, even if almost no one said it out loud: turning money into history. And for a brief moment, the person who best embodied that transaction was Consuelo Vanderbilt. Consuelo was not simply born rich, she was born inside a social machine. Her surname was a symbol of the new American power, fortunes built in a single generation, a speed of accumulation that Europe saw with a mix of contempt and fascination. But in certain drawing rooms, that wealth carried a shadow. It was wealth without antiquity. The money was real, yes, but the prestige, that old European prestige that seemed to come from blood and not from a bank balance, was still somewhere else. And that is where Alva Vanderbilt comes in. Because if Consuelo is the human face of this story, Alva is its engine. The mother did not see her daughter as a young woman with a life of her own ahead of her. She saw her as a key, the key that could open a door which in the United States still seemed closed. Total acceptance at the very top of the social hierarchy, not only as rich people, but as legitimate ones. And for Alva, legitimacy was not built only with mansions and parties. It was bought with something that America could not manufacture at home, a European title. The piece on the other side of the board was Charles Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. In England, that name had weight. Marlborough was not a nice title. It was a complete package, lineage, history, an inheritance that connected with centuries of British power. And above all, it included Blenheim Palace, a gigantic palace that functioned as a postcard from the past and as a bill in the present. Because maintaining a place like that was not a romantic gesture. It was a hemorrhage. Roofs, stonework, gardens, staff, endless restorations. The aristocracy could have castles, but less and less ready money. Many dukes, counts, and minor princes were trapped in a cruel paradox, rich in appearance and poor in their real ability to sustain their world. So when the duke looked toward America, he was not searching for great love, he was searching for survival. And when Alva looked toward England, she was not searching for a fairy tale either. She was searching for what money could not buy at home, except by buying it abroad. What happened afterward has been told so many times in a glamorous key that it is hard to see the rawness of the mechanism. Consuelo, according to her own memories, was in love with someone else and did not want that marriage. But the pressure was total, intimate, familial. It was not a negotiation between equals. It was an order disguised as destiny. The wedding took place in 1895, and from the start, it carried that atmosphere of a ceremony flawless on the outside and demolition on the inside. Brides plus one. Now, let us talk about figures, because in this kind of story, the figures are part of the script. Consuelo's dowry is often mentioned as one of the largest of the era, around $2.5 million in securities. It is usually said railroad shares, plus an annual agreement of $100,000. In practical terms, it was a direct transfer from America to one of the most famous noble houses in England. Brides. And here we find the detail that turns this story into a perfect symbol for the documentary. That money did not travel to create something new. It traveled to sustain something old. Because Blenheim was not just a home, it was a monument, a theater, a living proof that the past had taken the shape of stone. And stone, when it is not paid for, falls. So while the public saw an aristocratic union, what was really happening was a restoration financed from the other side of the Atlantic. Vogue. But the real question is not how much it cost. The real question is, who paid the price? Consuelo arrived in England and discovered something that almost no American heiress understood until she lived it. Marrying a title was not becoming the queen of the place, it was becoming a piece of the place. Suddenly, her life was full of unwritten rules, protocols, silences, looks that judged, and a constant feeling of being in a house that never quite became hers, even though she lived inside it. And meanwhile, the marriage was not an emotional refuge, it was a contract. The Duke needed stability and appearances. Consuelo needed to survive her own story. Because there is a kind of loneliness that does not come from being alone, but from being surrounded by people who treat you as a function. And in the great aristocratic residences, that loneliness can be amplified by every corridor. This is where the story becomes even more human. Because Consuelo is not a distant character. She is a young woman trapped in someone else's narrative, someone who learns late that elegance can be a form of imprisonment. And, if you think about it, that is one of the hardest blows in this whole phenomenon of the dollar princesses. It was sold as a fair exchange, as a pact between worlds. But the exchange was unbalanced from the beginning. Europe received money to sustain stone and history. America received a title, but sometimes lost a person along the way. In her memoir, Consuelo described the experience with the distance of someone who has already lived through the consequences. It is not a story of romance that gets complicated. It is a story of obedience that turns into wear, of a life rearranged to fit inside a display case. Brides plus one. And yet, so that it does not become a flat tragedy, there is an important nuance. Consuelo was not simply a passive victim all her life. Over time, like so many women trapped in rigid structures, she began to create spaces for decision-making within what she had. But that evolution, that personal reconstruction, does not erase the origin. She arrived in England as part of a deal. The marriage, in the end, broke on the inside before it broke on the outside. First came the separation, around 1906, then the divorce, which was formalized years later, already into the 20th century, when legal and social frameworks began to allow something that had once been an impossible scandal, for the Duchess to cease being a duchess. Brides plus two, Vogue plus two, and here comes a silent reconnection that is worth leaving planted, because we will see it reappear later on. When Consuelo frees herself from the title, she does not disappear. She changes shape. Her story becomes a public symbol of an era and a private reminder of what that era demanded in return. The life that Europe won in restored palaces also had a reverse side. Women forced to play a role until their bodies and minds could no longer sustain it. And now, go back to the wider map of the documentary. Because if this happened to Consuelo, the most famous heiress, the most talked about case, imagine how many similar stories unfolded without such big headlines, in less famous castles, with surnames that no longer ring a bell, with agreements signed in drawing rooms that today stand empty. The system was simple in its brutality. Europe sold prestige to buy time. America bought prestige to buy belonging, and in between, entire lives were rewritten. Europe kept a palace standing. Consuelo had to rebuild herself so as not to be buried inside it. And she was not the only one. At the end of the 19th century, newspapers began to use a curious term, half admiring, half ironic. Dollar princesses. The princesses of the dollar. It was a simple, catchy, almost comic label. But behind that phrase, there was a real and deeply symbolic phenomenon. The silent invasion of the European aristocracy by American money. Because what happened to Consuelo Vanderbilt was not an exception, it was the model. For about 2 decades, between 1880 and 1910, Dozens of young American heiresses crossed the Atlantic with the same unwritten mission: to turn dollars into titles. They were young, beautiful, educated, but above all, immensely rich. And in the old Europe, where the castles still stood but the bank accounts were collapsing, that was an irresistible attraction. In the United Kingdom, the pattern became almost routine. The British aristocracy had survived wars and revolutions, but not the cost of maintaining its properties. And marriages with American women became a respectable and profitable resource. There were examples everywhere. Mary Leader, daughter of a Chicago magnate, became Lady Curzon, Viscountess and symbol of imperial elegance in British India. Jenny Jerome from New York, mother of Winston Churchill, was one of the first to mark the way, a woman with a modern spirit in a society of rigid rules. Consuelo Vanderbilt, of course, the most famous, the most analyzed, and the most unhappy. But the fever was not limited to the United Kingdom. In France, where the taste for all things aristocratic remained alive even though the country was already a republic, the impoverished elite also looked westward. The American women brought liquidity, but also a different energy. They were more direct, more practical, less willing to obey empty protocols. In Germany, these unions were rarer, but they did exist. Some minor houses in the north and in Bavaria accepted American dowries discreetly, trying to keep an appearance of intact pride. The newspapers of the time hinted at it between the lines, as if it were an open secret. And yet, although the agreements seemed cold, the consequences were intensely human. The cultural clash was enormous. The American women arrived with a mindset that old Europe found fascinating and threatening at the same time. They were educated women, with opinions, used to a more equal treatment within their own class. They did not fully understand the rigidity of protocol, nor the submission to a surname that was revered as if it were a religion. In many cases, their husbands, men raised inside an unquestioned hierarchy, did not know how to deal with them. For some, they were refreshing. For others, they were a challenge. And for most, an uncomfortable reminder that the world was changing. Banquets and balls could disguise it, but behind the diplomatic smiles, there was something deeper. A cultural battle, silent every day, fought in the drawing rooms and bedrooms of the castles. Some dollar princesses adapted successfully. Others, like Consuelo, paid for it with loneliness and illness. But all of them left a mark. Their children grew up in two worlds at once, with British accents, but with American blood. And, without knowing it, many of these transatlantic unions prepared the ground for a Europe that was more interconnected, less isolated, although still deeply unequal. Sometimes, the stories of these women are told as society anecdotes, but what they really represent is a change of era. For the first time, the aristocracy no longer reproduced itself alone. It needed outside capital, and it accepted it disguised as romance. And there, in the middle of that theater of appearances, Consuelo Vanderbilt reappears briefly as a symbol. Not as the central character, but as an echo. Because her story is the most visible note in a far wider symphony. A generation of women who bought titles for their families and lost something of themselves in the process. The phenomenon of the dollar princesses changed the European social map without firing a single shot. It was not a military invasion nor a political one. It was an economic and emotional invasion. And while Europe was getting used to having Americans in its castles, some Americans were beginning to think there was another, more direct way to buy history. Because not all Americans came only to get married. Some came to buy something even more tangible. There was a moment in the late 19th and early 20th centuries when European prestige stopped being a metaphor and turned into a catalog. Not prestige in the abstract, not the idea of Europe as a living museum, but something more concrete: stone, land, towers, drawing rooms, coats of arms carved above doorways, everything with a price, everything negotiable. Because while the dollar princesses came into families through the door of marriage, another kind of American, less romantic, more direct, came in through the simplest door of all: purchase. In the European newspapers, the headline was always similar: historic castle for sale, noble property acquired by a foreigner, ancient family forced to give up its ancestral residence. And although the tone was sometimes scandalized, the truth was that most of those sales had nothing mysterious about them. The reason was the same almost everywhere: the numbers did not add up. Maintaining a castle was like maintaining a small town: roof, heating, dampness, staff, gardens, stables, paths, walls. And on top of that came two new forces that the aristocracy could not dodge: taxes and debts. For centuries, many of these families had lived on agricultural rents and privileges that seemed eternal. But the modern world did not just change the economy, it changed the logic. Fields no longer yielded as before. Industrialization shifted wealth toward the cities, states needed to raise revenue, and castles, which had once been symbols of power, began to be a burden. In France, the situation was especially dramatic. The aristocracy had survived revolutions, yes, but had not survived bureaucracy quite as well. Many owners kept up the facade of grandeur, while inside they were selling silver, paintings, furniture, and sometimes even wing by wing just to hold out a few years more. There were castles that looked intact from the outside, but inside were closed off, cold, empty, as if life had withdrawn from them. Italy offered another kind of scene. Palaces and villas inherited, many with centuries of history, but trapped in a country that was unifying laws, taxes, and administrations. A family might have an ancient surname and a modern economic reality that showed no mercy. There, the patrimony was immense, but the ready money was insufficient. And when urgency presses, pride begins to give way. In the United Kingdom, the fall was quieter, but just as real. Large rural estates, mansions, and castles that depended on an economic model that was less and less sustainable. The British nobility had perfected the art of appearing stable, but behind the protocol there was simple arithmetic. Either new money came in, or the building would fall. And then the buyers appeared, Americans who arrived with a different relationship to history, not as inheritance, but as acquisition. For many, it was a sentimental, almost aesthetic investment. For others, it was status. For others still, it was the feeling of owning something no New York skyscraper could give them, genuine antiquity. Sometimes the process was discreet, sometimes it was a public scandal, but the result was the same. A castle that had belonged to one family line for centuries passed into foreign hands with a signature. And what came next was even more humiliating for some nobles. The Americans restored the castles better than the Europeans themselves. Not always, but often enough for people to talk. Where an aristocratic family had postponed repairs for decades, an American buyer arrived with immediate capital, architects, workers, materials. Where a roof had leaked for 20 years, suddenly it was fixed in 2 seasons. Where the walls had dulled with damp, the paint came back. Where the garden had turned into half-wild land, order and design returned. And the irony was that in many cases those foreign buyers were doing what the original families could no longer afford, saving the building. Saving it, yes, but also turning it into something else, into a private luxury residence, into a summer home, into a personal symbol, into a collector's piece. For some Europeans, it was a rescue. For others, it was a desecration. Because a castle was not just a piece of property. It was a story. It was continuity. It was material proof that a family had existed, ruled, endured. And suddenly, that story could be rewritten with foreign money. A room lined with portraits of ancestors could become a drawing room decorated in American taste. A coat of arms at the entrance might still be there, but it was no longer a symbol of dominion. It was an ornament. And there the central idea of this part appears, simple but powerful. For the first time, European history had foreign owners. They were not invaders with swords. They were not armies. They were buyers. And that made it harder to fight, because there was no war to win. Only signed contracts, mortgages, creditors, banks. This stone market of castles and palaces also had a psychological effect. Europe began to see itself as a place that could be sold, not in the literal sense of Europe for sale, but in the sense that its past, its architecture, its prestige could be turned into merchandise. And for the Americans, that was a revelation. Because if you could buy a castle, you could buy the entire stage set of the European myth, the stone bridge, the tower, the gallery, the library, the family chapel. You could live inside history as if it were private property. But then, as often happens, ambition climbed a step. Because owning a castle was spectacular, yes. But some did not want only stone. They wanted something harder to acquire, something that cannot be restored, cannot be renovated, and cannot be bought with a check quite so easily. They wanted the oldest thing of all, real recognition, symbolic right, the aura that did not come from the building, but from the bloodline. And that is why the story does not stop with purchases. But some Americans were not content with owning castles. They wanted something even older. At first, the exchange seemed clear and almost honest within its own logic. Europe offered titles, surnames, castles. America offered money. A marriage, a sale, a deal. A transaction that could be explained in figures and clauses. But as the wheel began to spin, some Americans stopped thinking of the deal as a one-off event. They no longer wanted only to enter European history. They wanted something more ambitious, to continue it. Because it was one thing to marry a duke or buy a fortress, and another, much bigger thing, to build a dynasty. Not a rich family with properties in Europe, but a house with symbolic weight, a surname that sounded old, a family tree stretching into the future as if it had always belonged there. That was the dream that began to obsess certain millionaires, not to live as visitors in Europe, but as if they were part of the permanent fabric of the continent. And that dream often began with something apparently simple: the children. The children became the project. If American money was new, then it had to be educated so that it stopped looking new. It had to be trained, polished, softened, turned into something that could walk down the corridors of a castle without sounding like a visitor. And so the decisions began. Boarding schools in England, French tutors, etiquette classes, languages, fencing, European history. It was not just education, it was transformation. Because the goal was not for the child to learn a language. It was for the child to think in that language, to breathe in that cultural code, to understand the jokes at an aristocratic dinner, to know when to be silent, when to show up, when to appear indifferent, to learn the European art of distinction, that way of displaying power as if it cost no effort. In some cases, the American parents did not only send their children to Europe, they moved with them. They bought residences, settled for long seasons, tried to enter closed circles through persistence, donations, parties, connections. In others, the idea was even more direct, to change identity, not always literally, but practically. Surnames that were Europeanized, given names that were adjusted, customs imitated. Sometimes even religious conversions, if they made it easier to fit into certain spaces. The rich person began to act as if already belonging to an ancient tradition, hoping that, with time, the world would stop seeing the difference. And the curious thing is that, in part, it worked, at least on the surface. Because money opened doors, it allowed a lifestyle that many nobles could no longer sustain. It financed restorations, events, patronage. It turned a foreigner into a useful figure, someone who could save a castle, fund a social season, support a cause. But the dynastic dream is not built only with open doors. It is built with deep acceptance. And that is where the problem began. Europe could admire American money, even be grateful for it. But that did not mean it was willing to recognize it as lineage. Deep down, the European aristocracy could tolerate the presence of the rich American, even incorporate him through marriage. But there was an invisible barrier. The idea that lineage is not something you buy, but something you are. And that barrier was written in no law. It was social, it was psychological, it was cruel. The Americans could have restored castles, old paintings, dinners with ambassadors. But in certain drawing rooms, they would always be the new ones. There would always be someone to remember with a polite smile that their fortune was born of railroads, steel, or oil, not of a medieval battle or a 17th century alliance. That is why many attempts to found American houses in Europe ended up looking similar. A brilliant first generation, a second generation trying to fit in, and then a slow wearing down. Because even when a child was educated in Europe, something followed them. The pressure to play a role they had not chosen. To be European, not by birth, but by project. And that creates a deep tension. The child growing up between two worlds without feeling fully at home in either. Sometimes that conflict ended in private rebellion, marriages against the family's wishes, returns to America, divorces, quieter lives. Sometimes it ended in something else, desperate decisions to keep the story alive, spending more than could be sustained, trying to compete with an aristocracy that had been competing for centuries. And sometimes it simply ended in something more banal but definitive: time. Because founding a dynasty requires continuity, stability, historical calm. And the turn of the century offered none of that. The Europe where Americans tried to plant roots was about to become a more hostile, more nationalistic, more suspicious place. A place where suddenly being a foreigner would once again become a problem. That is where many projects broke, not because they lacked money, but because they lacked context. Because the future, which they imagined as a stage where their surname would consolidate, turned into unstable ground. And in an unstable world, symbols change in value. Suddenly, the title no longer impressed so much, the castle no longer meant security, the surname no longer guaranteed respect, and the slow strategy, the dynastic strategy, became almost impossible. That is why, when you look at it in perspective, the phenomenon leaves a bitter conclusion. Most of these attempts to create a European-American house did not fail for lack of ambition. They failed because they tried to build permanence on a continent that was about to break. And then the phrase that sums everything up falls with force, like a verdict. Money could buy the past, but not always the future. The castles could be bought, the restorations could be paid for, the titles could be obtained through marriage, but the future depended on something nobody controlled, not even the millionaires, history itself. And while some Americans dreamed of leaving their grandchildren an old surname, the world was starting to tighten. Alliances were cracking, countries were preparing. Modernity did not arrive with parties, it arrived with crises. And that feeling that the ground beneath the castles was no longer stable began to spread throughout Europe. Because there was something that neither nobles, nor Americans, nor marriages, nor money could stop. The arrival of an era in which crowns would fall, borders would change, and mansions, those European mansions that America had bought or dreamed of, would begin to become something else. Targets, ruins, refuges, symbols of a world falling apart. And so, without announcing itself with trumpets or ceremonies, history turns toward the next act, and then the world broke again. For a few years, the exchange had seemed almost inevitable. Europe sold prestige because it needed liquidity. America bought prestige because it needed a past. One could argue whether it was romantic or cynical, but it worked. Dowries plugged century-old leaks. Surnames opened doors that money alone would never have opened. And in the drawing rooms, even if there were sideways glances, the machinery kept moving. Until the moment came when Europe ceased to be a stage and became a front. The First World War did not just break treaties, it broke a language. Suddenly, everything that had once meant refinement, castles, genealogies, titles, began to sound like something else. Useless privilege, old world, people who did not understand what was happening in the street. And there the rich American in Europe discovered something uncomfortable, that his money could open a door, but could not control what people thought when they saw who was crossing it. In wartime, suspicion becomes a reflex, identity becomes a weapon, and wealth a reason to point fingers. Many Americans living among castles and manor houses began to be seen differently, not as exotic guests, but as foreigners with too much. Foreigners who could leave whenever they wanted, foreigners who, amid shortages, still lived surrounded by stone, gardens, and servants. And although some helped with hospitals, donations, or humanitarian efforts, the logic of resentment rarely stops to distinguish nuances. The prestige market needed stability to sustain its illusion, and war made everything unstable. Travel became complicated, money became uncertain. Governments started looking more closely at who owned what, fiscal pressure increased, and above all, a feeling spread that tainted everything, that the world of titles was, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, guilty. This is where the story of Consuelo, and of so many others, changes meaning without them being able to do anything about it. Because before you could tell it as an intimate tragedy within a social system, a young woman sacrificed to save a dukedom, a castle restored at the cost of a life. But with the war, that system stops being merely cruel and starts looking ridiculous in the face of need. How do you justify parties, coats of arms, and lineages when there are endless lists of dead? Meanwhile, the impoverished European aristocrat, that recurring character we have followed as a symbol, finds himself in an impossible position. Before, he could convince himself that selling prestige was a dignified form of survival, saving the house, maintaining the legacy. Now, suddenly, his legacy is not worth the same. It is not worth it in the market, and it is not worth it in public opinion either. There is a detail that often goes unnoticed. War does not only destroy buildings, it destroys habits. It destroys the rhythm by which a noble house relates to the world. It destroys the idea of a social season, of court life, of marriage alliances, as if that were the continent's natural structure. After 1918, many families discovered that even if they still had the surname, they had lost the ecosystem that made that surname mean something. And even then, it might seem that the system, wounded, could pull itself back together. After all, Europe had survived wars before. Castles had seen invasions, revolutions, shifting borders. Perhaps this was just another storm. But here comes the silent twist. The First World War was not just a war. It was a warning that the 20th century was not going to allow the same kind of privilege with the same ease. And then, when Europe was still stitching up its wounds, another crisis came, and then another, and then the final blow. The Second World War turned the European landscape into a place where prestige stopped being merchandise and became a risk. Because a castle in an industrial war is not just a beautiful house. It is a strategic point. It is a large structure. It is a place that can become a barracks, a hospital, a warehouse, a prison, a refuge, a command post. And that means that many properties, whether they belonged to nobles, bourgeois, or Americans, ended up being requisitioned, occupied, or used by forces that did not ask permission. Some owners were expelled. Others fled before the soldiers arrived. Others tried to stay and negotiate, hoping that their surname or passport would protect them. But war does not respect symbols very well. It respects usefulness, and the usefulness of a castle in war rarely matches the wishes of its owner. Here, the story becomes darker and also more confusing, because each region lived its own version of collapse: confiscations by regimes, military occupations, looting, fires, bombings, accidents that happen when an ancient structure becomes a target or a prize. In some cases, what was lost was not just the building. Family archives, works of art, libraries, private letters disappeared. The material memory of a house was lost. And there is a particularly cruel kind of tragedy in this. Many of those mansions that the Americans had restored, that they had saved with fresh money, new roofs, reinforced walls, were once again left to the mercy of chaos. As if history insisted on reminding them that the past is not bought forever. It is rented until the world changes the rules. And here it is worth pausing for a second, because this is the image that redefines everything. The same corridor that one year hosted gala dinners can become, the next, a hallway of boots and shouted orders. The same room where someone sought legitimacy can end up as an improvised infirmary, not because the castle changed, but because the century did. For the Americans, the message was brutally clear. Some returned to the United States for safety, others because they could no longer afford their properties, others because they understood that Europe was no longer a place where one could play at being aristocrat without paying a real price, and above all, because European prestige stopped looking like an emotional investment and started looking like a dangerous burden. And for the European aristocrats, the blow was double. Because they did not only lose properties or power, they lost the story. They lost the illusion of continuity. And many, even those who survived, found themselves in a different continent, with new borders, new laws, new ideologies, and a new kind of resentment toward anything that smelled of old regime. The prestige market, that discreet market of dowries, surnames, and ancient stone, did not die in a day. But here, between 1914 and 1945, it received what we might call its sentence. It became unviable as a dominant cultural system, too expensive, too unpopular, too unsafe, too closely associated with a world that had brought Europe to the edge of the abyss twice. And then the conclusion almost writes itself as an inevitable closure because it is no longer a dramatic twist. It is a fact. Europe was no longer a place to play at being aristocrat. And the question that hangs in the air, preparing the next part, is even more unsettling. If American money could no longer buy prestige in a broken Europe, what was left for those castles, those titles, those mansions that had been the perfect stage for the exchange? What comes next is not glamour, it is survival, it is ruin, it is oblivion, and in some cases, disappearance. Europe was no longer a place to play at being aristocrat. That sentence sounds forceful, until you ask what happened to those who had already staked their entire lives on that game. Because it is one thing to go home when the dream runs out, and quite another to discover that there is no longer a home to go back to. For many Americans, the bond with Europe was not a social season, nor a romantic adventure, nor an architectural whim. It was a signed marriage, a child born, a registered property, a new surname in the passport. And when the continent snapped shut like a trap, with shifting borders, collapsing governments, advancing armies, there were people who could not simply pack their bags. Some did not stay out of heroism. They stayed out of inertia, obligation, or fear. Because money, which once fixed everything, in wartime becomes a dangerous label. It either makes you a target, or makes you suspect, or makes you irrelevant. And almost always, it makes you vulnerable. Imagine the kind of life they had built. An American heiress in a European mansion. At first, the stage is perfect. Drawing rooms with painted ceilings, cabinets full of porcelain, libraries where every shelf looks like a cathedral. Staff move in silence, and the new surname is pronounced like a password. The local family, proud and ruined, breathes easier, because the house is warm again in winter, because damp no longer eats the walls, because the property is still the property. Then war comes, and everything begins to fall apart through small details. First, letters that never arrive. Then, censored newspapers. Then, friends who disappear. And finally, the real blow. Someone knocks at the door, and it is no longer a guest. In many places, castles and mansions become pieces on a board. It does not matter whether the owner is a duke or a banker. What matters is that the building is useful for its size, its location, its structure. And so, without needing bombs, a mansion can stop belonging to its owner without anyone signing anything. It is enough for someone to occupy it, to requisition it, to need it. And here the first silent tragedy appears. Americans who could not go back because they were no longer just Americans. Think of the women who had married European titles. Some had given up part of their identity to fit in. They learned another language, adopted new manners, faked a different confidence. Many had swallowed their pride for years to sustain a house that was never entirely theirs. And suddenly, they found themselves trapped between two worlds that were beginning to hate each other. In times of nationalism, an American woman in a European aristocratic house can become a tolerated oddity or a suspicious foreigner. And if the country goes to war, that suspicion becomes dangerous. There are documented cases of families who tried to neutralize their foreign members, hiding them in the countryside, keeping them away from the cities, erasing traces in documents, making sure their accent was not heard in public. Not because they loved them less, but because the world had become less human. Ideology does not need proof. It needs symbols. And a passport, a surname, or a place of origin are enough to turn you into a symbol. The second tragedy is even more intimate. Marriages broken by ideology. In the interwar years, prestige did not vanish overnight. It transformed into paranoia. The impoverished European aristocrat, our recurring figure, no longer thought only about debts and taxes. He thought about political survival. And in that context, many noble families flirted with extreme ideas, some out of conviction, others out of opportunism, others out of sheer panic. The promise was usually the same: order, stability, recovering what was lost. And what happens when the person you brought from America, who arrived believing in modernity, pragmatism, freedom of movement, realizes she is married to someone embracing an authoritarian vision of the world? Sometimes there are arguments, sometimes there is silence, sometimes there is a distance that grows for years, until one night it can no longer be hidden. And in wars and dictatorships, separating is not just a sentimental drama, it can be a risk. A divorce can be a scandal. An escape can be read as treason. A poorly written letter can become evidence. Ideology did not just break marriages, it broke entire families, brothers against brothers, children educated in one country, parents loyal to another. And in the middle, that mansion that in theory was refuge turns into a cage. The third tragedy is the coldest: total loss. In the world of prestige, a mansion is not just a house, it is a materialized promise. If this holds, everything will have been worth it. When that house is lost through confiscation, looting, fire, long occupation, it is not only stone that disappears, the narrative disappears, the meaning, the sacrifice. There are stories of owners who, after years of restoration, returned after the war to find rooms without doors, paintings torn down, empty libraries, floors ripped up. And the worst part, they found administrative silence. Nobody knew anything. Nobody had signed anything. Nobody was responsible. History had swallowed everything and spat it out in disorder. In some cases, the loss was so absolute that there was not even the possibility of a claim. Family archives destroyed, property papers lost, notaries dead, records burned. And when the documentation disappears, part of the past disappears with it. That is where ghost castles are born, places that existed, had names, were photographed, and after the war turn into gossip. And here comes a detail that often hurts more than ruin itself. There were those who survived, only to find that surviving was also a kind of loss. Because even when the castle was still standing, the world that made it meaningful was gone. The staff had left or died. The neighbors no longer looked with respect. Governments looked with tax demands. Society looked with resentment. And the owner, American or European, was left facing an enormous mansion, wondering what to do with a past that was no longer currency. We return for a moment to Consuelo, not as a case, but as a symbol. Because her story, the young woman turned into a transaction, represents the heart of this documentary. That the glamour was real, yes, but so was the price. And in wartime, that price became irreversible. It was no longer, is it worth it? It was, how do I get out of here? For many, the European dream ended up as a nightmare. And when a nightmare lasts years, it leaves marks you do not see in the photographs, decisions made out of fear, forced loyalties, family silences that last generations. Because the prestige market did not close only for economic reasons. It closed because the 20th century showed that there are things money cannot buy: safety, belonging, and a future without upheavals. But even among those who lost everything, something survived: the mansions themselves. Some were left standing, empty, damaged, waiting for a new owner, and others disappeared in an even more unsettling way, as if time, literally, had erased them. Today, when someone travels through Europe and walks into a castle turned into a museum, they almost never think of Wall Street, or of Pittsburgh, or of the railroads that stitched together the American continent. They think of kings, of medieval battles, of genealogies that fade into the distant past. They think of Europe as if everything they see had arrived here through pure historical continuity, as if the centuries had formed a straight line. But if you look closely, something does not quite fit. Too many palaces that should have collapsed and yet are still standing. Too many restored wings, too many rebuilt roofs, too many collections preserved when, in theory, the aristocracy had long since lost the means to sustain them. And that is where the invisible legacy appears. Because American money did not just buy titles, it bought time. It bought extensions. It bought extra years for structures that were doomed to fall. And in doing so, it changed Europe's heritage map without Europe ever fully admitting it. Think about how many castles look today. Some are museums, with immaculate rooms, elegant labels, routes designed so the visitor feels they are moving through centuries of intact history. But that intactness is often a carefully financed illusion. In more than one case, the continuity on display, tapestries, ceilings, furnishings, gardens, depends on decisions taken in offices on the other side of the Atlantic. Not always by an American, of course, but by the flow of capital that allowed these houses to survive until the state or foundations could take them over. Others are hotels, and here the paradox becomes clearer. Because a castle hotel is not just a tourist experience, it is the modern version of the old deal. Before, money restored the palace so the surname could go on existing. Now, the palace becomes a product so the building can go on existing. The mechanism changes, but the logic is similar. The past needs constant funding in order not to collapse. And we are not talking only about stone, we are talking about what sustains the stone: In the 19th century, an American dowry could pay for the repair of roofs and walls, the modernization of heating, water, electricity, the upkeep of gardens that required constant labor, the purchase or preservation of art collections, the hiring of architects, restorers, administrators, in other words, cultural infrastructure, even if at the time it was disguised as aristocratic life. Over time, that investment becomes almost impossible to trace because it mixes with other sources: inheritances, sales, loans, grants, later reconstructions. But the effect remains. Many buildings, as we know them today, are the result of several layers. And one of those layers, in a surprising number of cases, is called American money. There is a helpful mental image to understand this. Imagine a European castle as a huge ancient body. History gave it shape, yes, but the economy gave it oxygen. When the oxygen ran out, the body began to fail, and then came a transfusion. It did not restore youth, it restored the ability to go on living. That transfusion was not always visible and almost never celebrated, but it was there. That is why today, when you stroll through a restored gallery, when you look up at a carved ceiling that miraculously survives, when you sleep in a room with centuries of history turned into a suite, it is possible that you are enjoying a continuity that is not purely European, it is transatlantic. And here comes the sentence that sums up the phenomenon with blunt clarity. Europe does not remember their names, but it lives among their investments. Because the names fade. Social memory is selective. Europe remembers dukes, kings, architects, but it rarely remembers the American heiress who paid for the restoration that allowed the roof to go on existing. It rarely remembers the family that assumed debts to save an estate that is now national heritage. It rarely remembers those who sustained, with new money, an old past. And this does not happen only in architecture, it happens in the social fabric, in networks of prestige that still exist in certain circles, in surnames that sound European today, even though a decisive part of their story comes from America. In foundations, private collections, donations, cultural institutions that were born from that mixture. The question is inevitable. What do we do with a legacy that is everywhere, but almost nobody names? What does it mean that part of what we consider European heritage was saved or even reshaped by foreign capital? And here an uncomfortable question arises. If American money helped preserve part of Europe's past, does that mean it also changed it? That it bought it, shaped it, rewrote it? Because there is a huge difference between saving a castle and deciding what story that castle tells when it opens its doors again. There is a historical image we have so deeply internalized that it almost feels natural. For centuries, Europe was the center of the world. Europe explored, conquered, extracted, imposed languages, religions, borders, and systems of government. Europe colonized, and the rest of the planet reacted to that force. America, for a long time, was one part of that board, first as territory, then as promise, later as problem, and finally as power. But when we reach the end of the 19th century, something happens that is uncomfortable if you look at it head-on. For the first time, the flow of power begins to reverse. Not with armies, not with treaties signed after a war, not with flags planted on beaches. It happens in another way, a way that sounds less epic, but that, in practice, can be just as transformative. Money. Europe colonized America. Yes. It turned it into part of its economy, its imagination, its expansion. But later, decades on, a phenomenon appears that seems almost like a belated response, a kind of historical echo. America buys Europe. It does not buy Europe as territory, of course, but it buys something that, for Europe, was almost sacred. It buys symbols. It buys castles. It buys collections. It buys surnames through marriages. It buys access to drawing rooms that had been closed for centuries. It buys the feeling of belonging. And when you buy symbols, you are not just acquiring objects, you are acquiring a place inside a narrative. You are buying the right to be part of history. This is where the comparison becomes inevitable, even if it is uncomfortable. In classical colonization, power was material and military, control of resources, trade routes, population, laws. In this reverse colonization, power is economic and symbolic. Control over the survival of a heritage, over the continuity of an elite, over the aesthetics of the past. And that raises a question: which weighs more, symbolic power or economic power? Europe in that era still had prestige. It had the aura, centuries of bloodlines, traditions, titles, architecture, rituals. But it was slowly losing a part of the real power that makes all of that sustainable: economic capacity. America, by contrast, had the opposite: a brutal, growing, almost uncontrollable economic power, but without that aura, without that historical legitimacy. And like every new society that becomes rich too quickly, it had a problem that cannot be solved with more money alone: status anxiety. So the exchange becomes almost perfect. Europe offers history. America offers the fuel to keep that history running. But if you look at that exchange coldly, it is not neutral. Because when someone saves you financially, even in exchange for something, they change you. A castle restored with American money is not exactly the same castle, not only because its physical state changes, but because its relationship with the world changes. Who decides, who comes in, what is preserved, what is sold, what is displayed, what is hidden. There lies the most delicate point. America did not need to dominate Europe politically to influence Europe culturally. It was enough to sustain certain symbols once Europe could no longer sustain them alone. Think about what it must have felt like for a ruined European aristocrat. He had been something for centuries. And suddenly, he depended on an American heiress, an industrialist, a family that 50 years before had not existed on his mental map. For him, the money was a humiliation. For the American, the title was a purchase. And in the middle, the castle, history, tradition, turned into a kind of currency. That is why calling it colonization may seem exaggerated, but it also helps us grasp a truth. There was a transfer of power. Europe went from being the one that imposed to being, in part, the one that negotiated its symbolic survival. And America went from being the place without a past to becoming the place that could literally finance the past of others. This does not mean that Europe lost Europe, nor that America conquered Europe. It means something more subtle and, for that very reason, harder to see. The center of gravity was moving, and it was moving without the need for war. Because the most effective power is not always the one that occupies. Sometimes it is the one that sustains, the one that decides what is saved and what is left to fall, the one that appears as benefactor while quietly rearranging the real hierarchy. And that is why the question becomes even more unsettling when you take it to a wider level. If American money could enter so deeply into European aristocracy, into its properties, its titles, its symbols, what kind of empire is that? Not an empire of maps painted in one color, not an empire of colonial administrations, not an empire of flags and cannons, but an empire of influence, dependence, purchased prestige, finance, survival. An empire that is almost never acknowledged as such, because it does not fit the classic image of domination. And that is where the idea fits that runs through this documentary like an underground thread. Perhaps the quietest empire was the one that never had a flag. Because when there is no flag, there is no victory ceremony. There is no visible defeat. There is no exact day on the calendar you can point to and say, everything changed here. The change happens slowly, through contracts, marriages, discrete sales, restorations, family agreements. And by the time you realize it, the map is still the same. But the power holding it up is no longer coming from the same place. And if this exchange went so deep in the castles and the titles, there is an even more personal question. What did all this do to the people living inside? Because behind the prestige market, there was not only heritage saved, there were identities broken as well. If you look at this story only from a distance, it can seem like a balanced exchange. Europe offered titles and castles, America offered money and continuity. But when you come closer, when you follow the traces all the way to the end, an uncomfortable reality appears. Not everyone lost, and certainly not everyone gained equally. There were people and families who came out of this prestige market with something more valuable than a surname or a photograph in a gilded drawing room. They came out with fortunes that survived, and in some cases, those fortunes grew stronger. Because while many marriages broke, while some castles were confiscated during the wars, while old aristocratic houses dissolved in divorces, scandals, or impossible tax bills, there was a small, but decisive group that understood earlier than anyone else the new rule of the 20th century. Lineage was no longer a guarantee. Management was. The first thing that distinguishes those who survived is simple. They did not try to preserve the past as if the past were eternal. They translated it. They adapted it. They turned it into an asset with modern logic. And that, in a continent full of proud families, was almost a silent revolution. In traditional aristocratic Europe, a castle was a symbol, an obligation, an inherited burden. It had to be maintained because it had always been maintained. That lifestyle had to be sustained because it was part of the role. The problem is that the 20th century had no patience for roles. It had wars, inflation, revolutions, taxes, mass tourism, new industries, new elites. And in that world, a castle without a plan was a bottomless pit. The families that survived did something that, to many of their peers, would have sounded vulgar. They turned prestige into a business model. And that could mean many things. Some opened their residences to the public not as a cultural gesture, but as a survival strategy. They began to charge admission, to sell guided tours, to create events, to rent out spaces for weddings, film shoots, private dinners. Others transformed properties into hotels or luxury venues. Some sold part of their patrimony to save the core. Better to lose entire wings than to lose the whole building. And here, an important detail appears. American money, in some cases, did more than restore stone. It introduced a mindset. The idea that heritage is not just inheritance, it is investment. The idea that a historic property can be managed as a project, with income, expenses, brand, audience, reputation. It was not automatic. Many aristocrats resisted it, but those who accepted it in time realized something. The 20th century did not forgive you for being noble, but it did reward you for being efficient. Those who diversified also survived. Families that, instead of depending solely on traditional rents, moved capital into new sectors: banking, light industry, urban real estate, international investments. Sometimes they did it hand in hand with marital alliances with American money. Other times thanks to modern advisors. Other times because some heir had the lucidity to understand that a surname does not pay bills. And then there is another kind of survival, the subtler one. Not that of the visible castle, but that of the networks. Because some fortunes survived not because of what they owned, but because of whom they knew. Because of their ability to stay near power even when power stopped being monarchical. Aristocrats who went into diplomacy, who took positions in foundations, big companies, cultural institutions. Families that lost direct political influence but kept social influence. The kind of influence that does not appear in constitutions, but does appear in boards, in trusts, in closed circles where it is decided which projects move forward and which die. And here, the story becomes almost ironic. Many Americans crossed the Atlantic in search of history and legitimacy. But those who ended up winning in the long term were the ones who understood that the real value was not the title, but the combination of three things: property plus brand plus continuity. Because the patrimony that truly survived was not necessarily the oldest. It was the one that became useful. And when that happens, the question changes. It is no longer just who married whom or who bought which castle. The real question is, what was actually transmitted through this phenomenon? Not just money toward Europe, not just prestige toward America. Ways of thinking were transmitted, habits were transmitted, strategies were transmitted. The idea was transmitted that the past, if well managed, can be a business for the future. And that leaves a trail we can still see today. Because there are places in Europe that remain open, immaculate, alive, sustained by a model that was born precisely at that crossroads. When American money arrived and European aristocracy accepted, out of necessity, that survival would no longer come from blood, but from administration. But here comes the final blow in this part. That was the exception. Most did not have that lucidity. Most did not have that luck. Most did not have that initial capital. Most broke, scattered, evaporated into wars, divorces, taxes, and resentment. And that is why, after looking at those who won, the documentary has to turn to the other side, to what was left for the rest. Because if some left living patrimonies behind, others left something else. Incomplete traces, stories without endings, unknown heirs, lost properties, surnames erased from the social registers. But most did not leave dynasties. They left questions. There is a part of this story that is almost never told because it has no neat ending. It does not end in a portrait on the wall, nor in a mansion-turned-museum, nor in a family that survived by reinventing itself. It ends, very often, in something much more unsettling, in silence, in a gap in a record, in a signature that appears once and then vanishes, in a surname that dilutes like ink in water. Because if the prestige market was an exchange of money for history, it was also, without anyone saying so, an exchange of identity for survival. And when an identity is negotiated, adapted, and hidden for decades, at some point it is no longer easy to find it. Think about what it means to trace a bloodline in 20th century Europe. 2 world wars, borders that move like pieces of paper, empires that fall, states that are born, archives that change language, administration, format, documents that are lost, burned, evacuated, or left locked in buildings no one returns to. In theory, the aristocracy was obsessive about its family trees. In practice, real history was much more chaotic. There are castles that were sold and resold so many times that the ownership trail turns into a confused chain. Intermediary companies, divided inheritances, lawsuits, debts, foreclosures. At some point, the house that used to be the house of the X family stops being theirs and becomes just another property with incomplete documents, missing annexes, boxes full of letters, some heir stored in an attic, and that later ended up at an uncatalogued auction. And then there are the archives that were not lost by accident, but out of necessity. Because there were moments when carrying an aristocratic surname or being tied to a rich foreign family became a problem. Not to romanticize it, but for something simpler. History became dangerous. Regimes changed, speeches changed, enemies changed, and suddenly there were people who decided it was better if certain connections were not too clear. Many surnames were normalized. Others were shortened, others were adapted to the local language, others were hidden behind second surnames or given names, as if moving one piece were enough to keep the board from recognizing the player. And that was not always a master plan. Sometimes it was something as human as wanting a child to have an easier life, to not carry a surname that triggered suspicion, mockery, or resentment. At this point, the story of the dollar princesses becomes even more delicate. Because some of these women came to Europe and were trapped in a system that was not designed for them. Some had children, some did not, some separated. Some were pushed to keep up appearances even when the marriage had already broken inside. And when that kind of life fractures, the family narrative tends to simplify. Triumphs are told, cracks are forgotten. There are children who appear in social records and then disappear from family stories. Children who grew up far from court, far from the castle, far from the surname that was supposed to be the prize. Children who married unsuitable people by the standards of their time and were pushed aside. Children who inherited very little or nothing and learned to live with a past that existed only in yellowed photos and stories no one wanted to retell. And there is something more uncomfortable still. Children not recognized. There is no need to invent anything to understand that in environments where image was everything, there were secrets. There were relationships outside marriage. There were discreet pregnancies. There were arrangements to protect reputations. There were lives entirely rewritten in public so that the house could go on looking intact. If you think about it from a human logic, not from gossip, it is almost inevitable that it happened. When a person is treated as a symbol, their private life becomes a risk. And what is seen as risk tends to end in silence. Sometimes that silence is not total. Sometimes a trace remains, a letter without a full signature, a note in a margin, a will that mentions whom it may concern in suspiciously vague terms, an inheritance divided into strange percentages, a periodic payment that suddenly stops. Small things that, seen separately, mean nothing, but together build the feeling that there are missing pieces. And when the wars come, that puzzle shatters completely. During the First World War, many families became obsessed with seeming national enough. During the Second, that obsession turned into instinct. To be foreign or appear so could be a problem. To be rich or appear so as well. To be aristocrat in certain places and moments was outright dangerous. There were people who hid jewels, who hid documents, who hid paintings, who hid entire correspondences. And when something is hidden in fear, sometimes it is hidden so well that it is never found again. In the chaos of exile and confiscation, administrative gaps also appeared. Marriages registered in one place but not in another, births recorded with variant spellings, families displaced who rebuilt their lives in another country and left behind papers no one recovered. And over time, those gaps turned into contradictory versions, into family legends, into stories that each branch tells differently. Here it is worth pausing and stating this clearly. We are not claiming conspiracies. There is no need. Reality is strange enough without inventing anything. But it is reasonable to think, and this is a controlled speculation, not a verifiable fact for every case, that it is possible some people alive today are unaware of the price their family paid for a title. Not because there is a deliberate secret locked away, but because time and historical trauma erase things even when no one intends to erase them. Imagine someone who grows up with a common surname, in an ordinary life, with no castles, no portraits, no grand stories. And yet, somewhere up that family tree, there is an American woman who crossed the Atlantic with a huge dowry and a life decided by others. There is a marriage signed like a contract. There is a fall. There is a renunciation. There is a noble name that stopped being used. And that person may not know it, not because it is an epic mystery, but because nobody spoke of it. Because the family learned that speaking of it hurt, or was shameful, or seemed pointless. And then the silence was inherited just like wrinkles or the shape of the hands. And here we return inevitably to Consuelo, even if only as a symbol. Because if her story anchored us emotionally, it was for a very simple reason. She was not just an American with a title. She was proof that behind each transaction there was a concrete life, with repeated days, with loneliness, with decisions made by others. Now, imagine how many similar stories existed without a famous name, without a famous castle, without biographies, without books. Stories that remained in private letters, family rumor, a box someone threw away when clearing a house. That is the most ghostly legacy of the prestige market. Not only restored castles or mixed surnames, also lives that slipped out of the narrative. And when a story loses its narrative, it leaves something worse. Questions. Questions that are not answered with dates, but with doubts. Who really benefited and who paid the price? How many families bought history and ended up losing their own history along the way? How many identities were improved upward and then erased downward in order to survive? Because in the end, prestige was a shared illusion, but the consequences were real. And what remains, so many decades later, is this feeling of looking at a continent full of perfect buildings, built on incomplete stories. And that brings us to the end of this story. If you have come this far, you can already see the full picture. It is not a story of Americans conquering Europe, nor of Europe seducing America. It is something more uncomfortable, and for that very reason, more human. A story of desire. Desire to belong, desire to be accepted, desire to turn money into something that looks eternal. Because yes, American money crossed the Atlantic and transformed real things. It restored castles that were falling apart. It paid for roofs, walls, galleries, stables, gardens, heating systems that had never quite managed to be switched on. It financed the material survival of a world that was running out of oxygen. But when you look at the invisible part, the part you cannot hang on a wall, what you find is something else. What you find is that money could buy stone, but it could not buy belonging. The American millionaires arrived with the energy of a young country that was winning everything. And yet, many of them felt like intruders in the European drawing rooms. They could pay for the dinner, pay for the orchestra, pay for the upkeep of the entire castle. But they could not pay for that look that says, "You are still new here." That tiny gesture, that way of pronouncing a surname, that polite comment that is really a border. And here, naturally, the story returns to Consuelo one last time. Because Consuelo is not just a famous case, she is a perfect metaphor. Her life shows that the exchange was not clean, not romantic, not a fairy tale. It was an operation with winners and losses. And sometimes the winners were those who seemed to lose, and the losers were those who seemed to win. Europe gained money, yes. It gained continuity. It gained repairs, restorations, temporary stability. But in exchange, it allowed its prestige to become merchandise, even if it never fully admitted it. And America gained titles. Yes, it gained castles, surnames, photographs, invitations. But in exchange, it took on a truth no one wants to buy. The feeling that being inside does not mean being from there. Think about the paradox. America, so proud of its modernity, crossed the ocean to buy the past. And Europe, so proud of its past, agreed to sell it to pay for the present. They needed each other, but for different reasons. One sought legitimacy, the other sought survival. And when two needs meet, they can sign very elegant agreements that leave scars. The real tragedy is not only in unhappy marriages or squandered fortunes. It lies in something quieter, in the idea that status is like a house with invisible doors. You can live inside, but there will always be someone who notices that you came in through the service entrance. In some stories, the culture clash is told as anecdote. The American woman who spoke too loudly, the aristocrat who did not understand the value of work, the European family offended by a practical custom. But when you add up thousands of small differences, what appears is not comedy. It is wear, psychological wear, emotional wear, identity wear. Because what does it really mean to marry a title? It means your life becomes a symbol. Your body, your surname, your way of standing in a room become representation. And when a person is used to represent an idea, the union of two worlds, the salvation of a house, the refined new money, that person ceases to be free even when she seems to be. And do not think this only happened to the women. The European aristocracy also paid a price, even if it hid it behind impeccable labels. Many nobles became actors playing themselves. They sold parts of their history and then had to pretend nothing had changed. They got used to a kind of dependence that humiliated them in private, even if in public they still walked as if the castle were indestructible. And that contradiction breaks anyone, even someone with coats of arms on the walls. That is why, when the wars came, the prestige market collapsed so easily. Because what sustained it was not only money or titles or palaces, it was a collective psychological agreement. This means something. The moment history became dangerous, the moment the world demanded clear national loyalties, the moment a foreign surname stopped being glamorous and started being suspicious, the system ran out of air. And here, at the end, perhaps the most uncomfortable question is this: why do we still understand status as something that can be bought? Today we do not buy noble titles in the same way, or at least not so explicitly. But we still buy symbols. We still pay to belong to circles that promise something intangible. We still chase external signs, brands, contacts, access, names, exclusivity, to cover an inner feeling that money by itself does not give you an identity. And if you think about it, that is what that American high society was doing, building palaces to manufacture surnames. And that is what that European aristocracy was doing, selling surnames to preserve palaces. Today, the palaces may be different, the titles may be different, but the emotional mechanics are similar. So I want to leave you with a few questions, not to close nicely, but to close truthfully. Is it worth buying prestige if prestige does not embrace you back? If you can pay for the object but cannot pay for the feeling, what are you really buying? What are we buying today without realizing it? Are we paying for a status that exists only in the gaze of others? Are we investing in symbols that promise us belonging, when in reality the only thing they guarantee is the need to keep on buying? And one more, perhaps the most personal. If your family history were full of decisions made for status, how would you judge it? With admiration for the ambition, with compassion for the sacrifice, with anger at the price? Because the real price of status is not measured only in money. It is measured in freedom, in love, in peace of mind, in the possibility of living a life that is not a negotiation. And now, after castles bought, surnames erased, impossible dowries and lost archives, the story can be summed up in one simple idea. Not to reduce it, but to grasp it. The American millionaires bought Europe, but Europe never fully belonged to them.